It's very easy to have a soft spot for animals. They are genuinely pure and very easy to root for when things aren't going their way. This story has a little bit of everything. You're going to need to prepare yourself for an adventure that will take you down every emotional path. But it's sad yet inspiring. It's happy yet disheartening. If you're wondering how that's even possible, you're about to find out. It's a story about a man's genuine love for animals and the lengths he's willing to go to show it. It was a day that would change Jim Passmore's life forever. But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. It was a day that he'll never forget. It was a day that started like any other. He's a native of Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and loves to take walks. It was a crisp March morning, and he did what he always did, bring his dogs with him for a casual stroll through the forest. But it wasn't going to be like any other stroll. Jim loves nature, and he's lucky enough to have a lot of it in Broken Arrow. He's always been someone who can truly enjoy nature and all it has to offer. Rolling hills, crystal blue lakes, and some of the most beautiful vistas were everyday sights for these folks. There are very few things he loves more than wildlife and scenic walks, but his dogs are definitely on that list. He loves dogs more than anything. The trio, Jim and his two dogs, would frequent the same walking path regularly. However, Jim noticed something odd in the creek one day when he was taking a stroll. He got closer, but it was incredibly hard to see exactly what they were looking at. It looked like a log floating out in the water, but as he took a better look at it, he could see some hair. It looked like some type of animal had been trapped in the mud. Jim wasn't sure, so he got a little bit closer and he could see something struggling. It looked weak, but whatever it was had been stuck in the mud near the creek's bank. Jim usually walks around the creek for a half hour a day, but on this day he was going to be there a lot longer than that. As Jim approached the mystery mound, he noticed that his dogs began to start acting weird. These are two pups that have been acclimated to the area many times, so this was especially strange. The dogs began to growl a deep, visceral growl. His dogs wouldn't let him walk closer to the mound. They seemed to be protecting him from something, but he didn't know what. His dogs started retreating from the scene. He followed his intuition and pressed onward to figure out what was floating. First, he noticed an animal cage. Okay, that was weird, but it could help figure out what this animal was. Jim's first thought was that it was a beaver. That would make sense. I mean, beavers float in the water all the time. Surely it's just minding its own business and doing its own thing. But the cage made that claim seem odd. The cage looked like something you would transport animals in, so he peered inside of it to see if he could garner any more information about what the cage could have housed. Maybe the beaver was using the cage as shelter, or maybe it was a few groundhogs using an abandoned cage as their home. The scenarios kept running through Jim's head. But that wasn't the case at all. What Jim saw sent shivers through his spine. There were feces all over the ground of the cage. Jim also found a blanket that was incredibly dirty and a weighted chain. This was the moment that Jim knew something wasn't right, that someone had purposely done this. Someone had chained an animal to this cage and now it wasn't there. He saw a whole bunch of weird markings on the cage. There was a huge bite on the side of it. Oddly enough, a beaver came out of the woods and startled Jim, so he followed the beaver to the river and it finally came to a halt. He had no idea what he was doing, following the beaver, but he felt like he needed to do it. Just a couple of feet away from the beaver there was a struggling animal. It was the same mound that Jim had seen earlier. The dampness of the woods and the ground had become increasingly soft. Jim ventured forward and quickly saw that the animal was bigger than a beaver. It couldn't be a beaver. The large creature seemed to be stuck in the mud, and without thinking, Jim sprung into action. He had to help the poor critter out, but one thing kept playing in his mind. He still had no idea what this thing was. Whatever it was, Jim was certain that he was going to get it out. He couldn't bear to leave a struggling animal fighting for its life. Jim figured that if this was, in fact, a beaver, it would be incredibly territorial. While his gut feeling told him that it probably wasn't a giant beaver, he still needed to be aware of those teeth just in case it decided to get free and chomp him like a salad. Beavers usually bite humans when they have rabies too, so this whole situation could go from hero to zero very quick. Whether Jim called over a few people to help him, and one of them ended up getting bit. They rushed him to the hospital. but the rest of the team ended up staying put to try to get this animal out of the mud. Jim had to come up with a plan to avoid getting attacked again. Jim realized that he had to cover the animal's head. He had no idea how long it had been in the creek for, and it was surely alarmed by the number of people trying to get it out. It quickly calmed down after the jersey was placed over its head. I mean, not going to lie, I would be freaking out even more if my vision was suddenly gone, but good for the animal. Jim needed a plan that could hoist the animal out of the water. They tried to dig around it, but since the animal was half submerged in the mud, it was incredibly difficult. They needed a pulley system or some sort of crane. Unfortunately, there wasn't going to be a crane anytime soon, so they would have to go with a pulley. They quickly realized there was a flaw, though. The mystery animal was refusing to budge. It seemed like it was truly stuck and had no plans of wanting to be free. But they kept trying, and eventually they started to feel it getting looser. This gave them a new sense of will to try even harder. They gave it one final yank, and the beaver was lifted to safety. But as Jim wiped the animal's face, he stumbled backward. This was no giant beaver. This was no giant groundhog. This was a dog. Beneath the mud was a quivering, yet beautiful sheepdog. They weren't messing with a territorial beaver. They were dealing with a scared dog. It looked like the dog had been there for quite some time, but was in relatively good shape considering all of the stuff that seemed to happen to it. So, how did it get there?